Fool's Day jokes. We missed it by a day. That's Friday. That'll be everybody who's working tomorrow. That'll be their uh, April Fool's Day. Um, Oil prices close out the first quarter nearly bang on the nose, $100 average on Brent. Today, of course, they're a little bit higher, nearly 109, 109, just above that, but dropping heavy this morning in early Asian trade over $4. That's about 4% decline today. Seems to be some news pushing a slightly, this is a volatile market, headlines one way or the other, but the headline overnight that seems to be at least giving some direction in Asia today has been the announcement that the US is looking to release 1 million barrels a day from its strategic petroleum reserve for 6 months. That's quite a number. I can't quite recall when the last time that's happened. Let's kick off this morning with our regular Thursday morning commentator, Dr. Carol Knackley, CEO of Crystal Energy. Carol, should this give OPEC Plus pause for thought as they meet today for their 27th OPEC non-OPEC ministerial meeting?
Good morning, Sean. Good morning, everyone. Well, look, even before this announcement was made, or at least became more public, OPEC Plus was not really warming up to the idea of putting more than 400,000 barrels a day in the market. And if you heard the various statements made by officials, including the UAE energy minister, asking the US to trust OPEC Plus, or I'm not sure what that meant, but we're getting all sorts of signals that OPEC Plus was unlikely to deviate from its commitment of the 400,000 barrels a day, though we might see, because that's what we're expecting to see, changes in the quotas, because you remember when we had this agreement in July last year, it was resolved by saying, okay, by the end of when the deal reaches an end in April this year, then quotas for 5 members are going to be revised, and that includes Russia. Though I'm not quite sure how that would be realistic or not, but we're also hearing that there could be also other members within OPEC where their quotas are adjusted. So we're going to see adjustments in the quotas of OPEC Plus, but it's not going to change the aggregate amount of oil that they want to put in the market for the time being. And the announcement of the SPR released 1 million barrels a day for 180 days. That will definitely be another factor that will give them the strength to stick to their what they already, the kind of, not decision, because they are yet to take this decision today, but at least what they have been sending in terms of signal to the market all around the world.
Kate Durian, a Mies contributing editor, a non-resident fellow at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. You've spent the last week or more, Kate, out in the Gulf meeting a lot of your contacts. What is your takeaway from all of those soundings vis-a-vis OPEC Plus resilience not to get sucked into the Ukraine vortex?
Well, I think they have, if you look at what the UAE minister said, it's like, they don't like being told what to do. They're saying, we're looking at technicals, we're looking at fundamentals, and if anything needs to be done, we'll do it. And as Carol said, we will have this readjustment of the baselines, whereby I think 5 countries, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, and I think the UAE will have higher baselines. But of course, some of the baselines are very unrealistic. For example, for Russia, it goes up to 11.5, I think. So it's... when I talk to people from OPEC, I say, the market needs a signal that you are ready to act, or at least show some flexibility. But I think the more that the US and the EU tell them, you've got to drop Russia from the OPEC Plus alliance because it doesn't look good for you to be sitting down with them at this point, the more they've become hardened. And I don't think they're going to deviate from their policy at the moment. But again, as you see, if the US says they haven't confirmed they're going to release 1 million barrels a day from the strategic reserves, but that was a signal. Whether you see the oil on the market or not, or whether it's taken up in full, it was a signal, and that's why prices are down. Of course, the Asian, China economy slowing down has an impact as well. But it's a very volatile market, so it could be down today, it'll be up again tomorrow.
Hey, just to follow up on that point, I mean, both you and Carol referenced the UAE minister, but I'm surprised you actually didn't reference the Saudi minister, which of course is the biggest actor in the room and was, in my opinion, being quite political in the last week, running into the OPEC meeting today by making it pretty clear that as long as there's missiles coming from the Houthis into Saudi Arabia, they are not going to be taking action to try and support or ease the global oil supply situation. So in essence, it's nothing to do with the divorce to Russia. It's really all to do with come bail us out in Yemen. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? That seemed pretty clear to me.
Yeah, I think that's basically they want some kind of guarantee. Like you're asking us to do something, but we're under attack. So what are you going to do about it? You're talking to Iran. They want certain guarantees. And I think they're probably willing to be a bit more flexible because at the end of the day, Saudi Arabia has the capacity. They are the swing producer, whether they like it or not. I mentioned Suhail Masroor because he actually spoke, before and he spoke since. And the one thing that he said is don't tell us what to do, basically. And that's where I think it, that's what it's all about because they can't be seen to be bending, but again, they say leave politics at the door. But at the same time, you look at the fundamentals, we've lost some of Russia's oil production and products. We may lose some more. So the fundamentals, we were tight going into this market before the Ukraine invasion. So to say that fundamentals don't warrant an increase, I think is a bit,
well, perhaps they warrant
like it's more of a political decision.
I mean, at least meet the commitment you've made. Tony Quinn, operating partner at ProStar Capital, CEO of Tank Bank International. Tony, welcome back. Can you give us some insight from what you're seeing out your window in Singapore, as well as into your storage tanks? Is there shortage anywhere? Is Asia screaming for more oil? Is OPEC Plus calling this right? Steady as she goes, 400,000 a month.
Mm-hmm. Well, firstly, I'm actually in the Philippines, but
okay.
you just thought that was the Kerry Hills in the background. I know.
Well,
Sean.
It's all of the above.
So in terms of the storage squeeze, yes, we're seeing it both in Fujairah, where we have operations, and in Asia. So I think, where we've had oil prices at this level, the traders get nervous about long-term commitments and start wanting to be more short-term in everything they do. So we start having this situation where everyone wants to go for the shortest possible term, whereas, a year or so ago, 2 years ago, we were looking at 3-year commitments. Now it's like 6 months if we're lucky. So we're finding that difficult. I think the storage world is finding it difficult to manage because we've had a relatively smooth passage for the last 10 years or so. So I think that's sort of coming into play. But I mean, picking up on some of the comments we've made about OPEC, I mean, I'd reference something, for instance, Prime Minister Lee of Singapore, who's also was with Biden last week. He came away with that, and the Straits Times ran an article this morning basically saying how he's worried about the future of smaller countries. So Singapore is pretty small, as you know. We're a powerful country, but a very small one. And so, the lack of action to support Ukraine, both from Europe and the US particularly, is worrying Prime Minister Lee, which means it worries the whole of Asia. And you can imagine what that means for Taiwan and other countries. So just making that point.
So
really,
sort of the point being, Tony, that if you're not a member of NATO, you cannot rely on our defense.
Well, it doesn't look like you can rely, full stop. And I think that's a worrying factor in this market at the moment that we're in, because everyone's a little bit nervous about what's going to happen. But when you have, a stable country like Singapore expressing those sort of concerns this morning in the press, that's quite concerning.
Well, let's go to Dr. Carol Ackley on that point. I know, obviously, Carol, you're not a geopolitical analyst, but ultimately you watch the European market pretty closely. Germany is now facing, this government that declared yesterday, put on warning that the minister that of the potential for gas rationing and gas shortages in the biggest economy in Europe, one of the world's top 3 exporters of all things amazing, technology, cars, my washing machine. I mean, the list goes on. Ultimately, this starts to look like it's becoming existential for Europe. And the idea that you're in NATO, you're not in NATO, ultimately, as Tony's pointing out, all economies and all countries in Europe are under threat from this escalating crisis.
Absolutely. I mean, let's face it, I mean, there is a massive crisis. I mean, just as we saw that the worst of Corona the pandemic was over and we're all going to go back to some kind of normality, we're hit by something that many people did not foresee, for at least for the time being. Now, with Germany, you said the right word, threat. So the risk is there. It has not materialized, but they are preparing for the worst case scenario. And all along from the beginning, Sean, I think we discussed this on the show several times, that the possibility of Russia cutting its supplies to Europe cannot be entirely ruled out, even though that's what's going to hurt, or it's going to hurt Russia even more than the European customers because of the nature of the gas business, and Russia depends more on pipeline than LNG. Now, so for Germany is preparing for the worst. Having lived in Germany for more than 2 years, I was thinking, okay, how are they going to go around that rationing? I mean, the good news is that the winter season is, I think, over now in Europe, and so the temperatures are higher, the days are longer. So the pressure that you had when it comes to natural gas demand for at least domestic consumption and household consumption can be reduced, or can be there could be a downward pressure on that. There will be an impact on industry, because that's what the government said this will be the first sector there, or the actor in the economy that they will target. But then I think about the impact on the economy, what that translate into economic growth impact. But at the same time, it made me think about two additional points. This is an economy which was quite aggressive in its push for climate change, and they were asking households to have a certain percentage of their energy coming from renewable energy. And this is an economy that that turned its back on nuclear energy. So what other options they have in the short term? And if rationing does not work, are they going to go back to coal or increase the consumption of coal, because they never really ditched coal? And you have this kind of dilemma, especially with the structure of the government that you have in place today, how to marry, which one is going to take the bigger priority? Is it energy security or climate security? And I think that's what I found most interesting in the dynamics that Germany. I have one concern, however, and this is something perhaps that we learned from the 70s crisis, the first oil shock. Usually when governments interfere too much, they tend to cause more trouble than solve the problem.
Interesting. Yeah, where the market can solve this problem. Kate, there's a lot of, it seems, increasingly growing dependency, perhaps shifting, and about these big structural changes in terms of new oil, new energy supply, more importantly, perhaps gas. But the US starting to emerge as a pretty critical new energy supplier for Europe. Over the midterm, long term, perhaps that has some legs. Over the short term, what is your outlook for that?
If you look at the region in general, like the Middle East, the Gulf states, there is no extra capacity, gas, LNG. Egypt potentially in the future, but not immediately. I think actually, if you look at the US, the current expansions, new trains coming online, LNG trains, they will have some excess capacity by the end of the year. But again, these are not cargoes that are committed to a certain customer, so they can go spot market and they'll go where the money is, because these are private companies. They're not. So I think even with political pressure, it's not going to be that all of these new, all this new LNG coming online from the US is going to go to Europe. So it's a very, very tight market. And I think we're going to probably see, if you look at the price of gas, which has shot up again today, and the price of oil, you might see some switching because it's still cheaper. Oil is still cheaper if you can find it, of course. And this whole thing with the ruble, I said the other day, you might see a disruption to gas supplies, before. Obviously, it's not going to happen today or tomorrow, but they seem to be quite serious about asking for payment in rubles. We heard the CEO of ENI saying at the Atlantic Council a couple of days ago, saying we're not going to pay rubles. So where does this end? And one of the articles that you highlighted today in the media roundup says, we're still paying Putin's war chest with oil and gas sales. So we haven't seen major disruption yet, but I think the possibility that it's going to happen. And let's not forget, it's not just about oil, it's about products as well. Diesel has an impact on industry. It has an impact on agriculture because agriculture runs on diesel. And Russia is a big exporter of diesel. The Middle East may be able to provide more, but we've seen refinery shutdowns in Europe. I mean, all of that is leading to this kind of tightness. And also food security. Look at Egypt. Ramadan's coming in a few days' time. You know, food prices going up. There's a potential for social unrest. You know, Iraq prices, inflation. We're all suffering from it.
Tony, one of the potential reliefs that we saw sort of impact the oil price during the week here is reading the tea leaves on China's cooling economy. Obviously they're dealing both with COVID lockdowns growing, and once Omicron gets into your economy, your society, it's very difficult to shut it down. But what's your outlook there for the sort of narrative that China's economy, China growth this year will be less than expected, less than forecast?
But I think the first stage of that really is that they've gone for a zero in China. They've gone for a zero COVID policy, which is not what everyone else has done. So they've taken a very hard line. It's hit their economy, but they want to sort of be eradicated from. We're all thinking Omicron may be the last one, but we know it probably isn't. They're thinking we want to eradicate this now. So they're very, very strong on it. So it will affect their economy, but don't forget they've got plenty of ballast, if you like, in their strategic business over there, and their tanks are all pretty much full of relatively cheap, mainly Iranian oil that they have. So that sort of situation from the oil perspective, I don't think it's going to make a huge issue in terms of flow, but it does make a headline, and a headline makes a sentiment, and a sentiment moves the price. So it's sort of, it's not really a physical issue. It's more of a mental issue on how we see the relationship there going forward. I mean, the big one that I think is the issue is India. Rather than China. I mean, they're a very vast consumer like China, but what you've seen in India is that they've actually been buying quite a lot of oil from Russia. In fact, last year they bought 16 billion barrels last year, and they've actually bought 13 million barrels in the since the 24th of February. So they've almost bought the entire 21 stock that they bought from Russia in the last few weeks. So
a very cozy meeting yesterday between Modi and the foreign minister of Russia.
Exactly, yeah. but you can see where they're going. If you remember rightly, my story has always been India hurt at 70. They're killing themselves at 80, and they're sort of dead at 100 when it goes to that sort of price. So where we're sitting now, they can't run the refineries. Reliance can't operate on that sort of number. They're not geared to do that. So they have to buy the cheapest oil they can, and they're pushed against Russia for a supply because that's the only way they can bring their price down. Now, it's not helping their economy because their government lost control of the pricing policies they used to have there in 2017, I think it was. So now there's a bit of a free market, and everyone's trying to make some money after the pandemic, which is the wrong time for bringing the cheap oil in, but the refineries can operate on that. And you're looking at a position in India where 63% of the gasoline sales goes into two-wheelers and three-wheelers, 34 into cars, and on diesel 70% into trucks, 30% into farming. So then it's going to affect food, and we know Ukraine obviously is a big wheat producer, and Russia is a big wheat producer. 25% of the world's wheat comes from those two countries. That's going to be a big impact as well from this crisis moving forward, as we can't afford some of these things, particularly in some of the poorer countries of the world.
Carol, could we just talk a little bit about in the midst of all this, we haven't even mentioned the word inflation and rate rising cycle, and particularly because the Fed now seem to be acknowledging or signaling the intention to accelerate their rate rise, their tightening cycle. What's your thoughts on the impact that could have over the second half of the year, and as well as where does Europe go with this continued challenge of inflation?
We're adding to this gloomy scene that we are discussing, which is primarily, of course, I mean, with the Fed, there is no going back. They are proceeding with the increase in interest rate, and we see how they are becoming more determined than ever. And I don't think, you see, I'm not worried about too worried, at least not for now, but I may change my mind by next week, about the impact that could have on the US economy. The US economy is actually doing much better than many other economies. I am perhaps more concerned about the poorer countries, developing economies, which have their debt is denominated in US dollars. And for them, if the interest rate increase in the US, then the debt servicing, the cost of the debt for them is going to increase. So add on top of that, that they have little room, for example, to support their economy, because as Kate said, as Tony said, you know, you have it's not just energy prices going up, it's also wheat, corn, all these important commodities that these countries need requires. It's not just, so we cannot look at the Fed's policy as limited to the US. It has a global impact, and the same thing for Europe. Now, of course, I hear more and more people talking about recession than, let's say, a month ago. That is something that we have to wait and see if we're going to, if some economies will will go back into recession. Already I see some countries, including like Morocco, they may well go into recession if things continue as they are today. But it is becoming more of a major economic challenge, just as we thought that we turned the page on the darkest phase. The good news in all that is that if we head into a slower economic growth, then that will ease the pressure on energy prices. So that's the only silver lining I see in this gloomy scenario.
Yeah, well, hopefully it doesn't come with stagflation. Let's go to the survey question for this morning, which sort of end of Q1, get an outlook for Q2 on this overarching story, which has come to dominate everything, a bit like COVID, as Carol said earlier. What is your outlook for Ukraine war and the face-off between Russia and West in Q2? This is a sentiment question, ultimately. Is it going to get much worse? Is it just going to get worse? Is it going to be same, or is it going to get better? Q2, this growing crisis. I mean, there's talk this week of the Russians pulling back from Kiev. Is there progress in the talks? Is that real? Is it not? Is it smoke and mirrors and sort of fog of war? Mariupol seems to be the possible symbol of how things can get much worse, like we saw in years past in Chechnya and in other places where similar, Syria, where the Russians have engaged this kind of total destruction strategy. So my question today, can it get much worse, get worse, same, get better in Q2? I welcome your vote on that. Kate, I wanted to get your thoughts on the story overnight between IEA and OPEC having a little bit of a spat. Is it serious? Is it not? You obviously spent many years working at the IEA and many more years covering OPEC. You know, for I would say in my cycle of journey with covering these two organizations, the first half of my journey, they seem to be very polar opposite sides of the street. Then the second half of the journey, they seem to have been very cozy. Sometimes you couldn't really tell the difference between OPEC and IEA. And now we have this headline or the story of OPEC considering removing the IEA as a secondary source. Your thoughts on that?
Yes, I mean, in recent years, we've seen the IEA and OPEC cooperate more, and on the technical level, the two sides that are sort of on the oil market side meet regularly and look at the numbers. And there's obviously this symposium in Riyadh that's held every year to compare the outlooks of the IEA and OPEC. But we've seen a divergence in the demand numbers recently. And I don't think, I think the monitoring of flows has changed. Now it's satellite imagery, it's tanker tracking, which is much more sophisticated. The likes of Kepler, who came out of nowhere recently, have become so big that you don't really need the kind of the OPEC surveys that are done by the price reporting agencies, by the IEA, by IHS Markit, which has, very good data, obviously. But the way that we monitor these flows has changed. We have much better monitoring that you don't really need the IEA. But I think it just shows that they're upset at declarations made by Fatih Birol saying that it's disappointing, putting out these roadmaps of how Europe can reduce its dependence on oil, which of course affects them. So I think I don't know if it's done out of spite or if it's really serious, but they've dropped other people in the past, but I think it just shows that the relationship is not as healthy as it used to be. They just don't like being told what to do. And if the IEA is going to say to them, you should be increasing your oil, while at the same time putting out this net zero scenario, which really upset them, then,
it's another fracture, perhaps, in this with us or against us line, as increasingly so many definitions will fall either side of. Tony, on that point, Asia, we've clearly seen China and India, generally regarded as somewhat frenemies at the best of definitions. But the idea that India and China have both been rather agnostic and unwilling to sort of condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the subsequent sort of slaughter, if you like. But where is the rest of Asia falling? And are there other fractures there vis-a-vis this crisis in Europe?
Yeah, I think in Asia, obviously the Singapore authorities and government are very supportive of action against Ukraine and been very vocal. They weren't one of the 3 countries in the world that voted against, or abstained. So the rest of Asia is a little bit hazy in terms of Thailand, Vietnam. I'm not quite sure. I'm in the Philippines at the moment. I know that my good friend Karim Garcia will be shouting the answer at me at the moment from Manila, but I'm not quite sure where Philippines are governmentally on this at the moment. But I see that Singapore tends to pull in the Asian group. And they tend to lead it, hence, sitting with Biden last week and that sort of relationship. So I can't give a specific on that, Sean. Otherwise, I would have looked that.
We have seen more recently, and obviously a lot of things drop off the news cycle because some dominant narratives like Ukraine, but ultimately there's an ongoing fracture between the Philippines and China over definitions in the South China Sea. We had just in the last week Coast Guard vessels coming very close to each other in what is generally acknowledged to be Filipino waters. Are those kinds of tensions? Is there concerns at all that a Russia into Ukraine could be a China into any other? I mean, China into the Philippines, for example.
Yeah, well, as I say, myself and Karim run a business in Subic Bay, which is the largest terminal actually in the Philippines. We've been seeing those sort of incursions here from a governmental perspective for a while. But there's been no real action in terms of, no one's knocking anyone around or anything like that at this stage. But it is a worry and it's a concern, and it's rather like, the Japanese water incursion as well. And then the threat to Taiwan, it's all the same sort of thing. But the one thing we know about, and I come from a country that's 80-90% Chinese. If you look at the Chinese, they're not confrontational. So that the Chinese race doesn't confront. If you look at the history of the country all the way back, you don't see that sort of confrontation. So there will be the quiet way of grabbing land, or for instance, taking over things on the Silk Road. I mean, it's very clever. You go in there, you put a big loan in, you buy up half of Sri Lanka, and then they can't pay the loan, so you end up owning it. So those are sort of clever political moves that they've done across Africa and anywhere on that Silk Road route. But in terms of the incursion into Philippine waters, I don't know how far they will go until there's some action. And as you know, here in the Philippines, there's an election in a couple of weeks, so there's going to be maybe a regime change here in terms of the way the country is governed, and maybe we will see Marcos back in power, his son. So I think
most definitely you're going to see Ferdinand Marcos return, well, his son return to power, and that's rather an extraordinary outcome.
We call him Bong Bong out here. We have great names in the Philippines. So.
Well, Bong Bong is going to have to bang maybe with the Chinese when he comes into office. Let's go to the survey result and give Carol the last word this morning. Not a very pleasant outcome, at least from this room, in terms of the outlook. Get worse, at least it doesn't get much worse. I suppose that's a positive. Carol, your closing thoughts. We're going into the Middle East weekend, at least we are here in terms of our podcast and so forth. the OPEC decision today and the rest of the week. What are your thoughts you might be keeping an eye on besides the OPEC meeting outcome, which is somewhat predetermined?
First of all, we want to see to what extent this SPR announcement is going to be made, like in terms of official, and of when it's going to kick the market. That's another thing to contemplate, in addition to OPEC Plus decision, even though they're not expecting really major surprises. But to comment on the survey question, I went for same, because wars of this scale involving such important players, they might seem worse one day, but another day they talk about peace and then they go back to being worse. So I'm looking more at the net effect, if you want, over a month or two. And I don't expect it to be resolved anytime soon. This is a problem that even if there is peace agreement tomorrow, the war is not going to end with it. There will always be pockets of resistance. Don't forget, there is blood that has been spilled. People want to take revenge. It's not something that's going to be resolved overnight. And I don't want to say that we have to get used to it, but I fear it's going to drag much longer than people expected.
Indeed, it will. And for all of those in this group and listening to the podcast as it's distributed afterwards, Ramadan Kareem, happy Ramadan to everybody celebrating the holy month, starting, I think it's a Saturday, Sunday, obviously depending on the moon cycle and sighting. Kate Durian, as always, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Carol, as always, anchoring Thursdays, and Tony Quinn with the exotic Filipino background. We're all jealous. It'd be lovely to be out there, and half my staff is shouting across the room. They want to come and join you. All the best, everybody. Have a great weekend. We'll see you Sunday morning with the great Mike Muller and Christoph Ruhl. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.